On a storm-lashed night at Greystone Hall, a man dies beneath a portrait that whispers warnings no human voice could make an impossible murder, no lock or key can explain. Where are you listening from? The rain came sideways across the Sussex Downs that night, a grey roar that blurred hedgerows and turned the windows of Greystone Hall into trembling mirrors. Somewhere in that deluge, a scream rose thin, strangled, and instantly swallowed by the storm. By the time anyone reached the East Gallery, the impossible had already taken place. Sir Julian Deverell, the last of his line and patron of many eccentric causes, was found dead beneath the portrait of his long-dead ancestor, a painting said to whisper to the living on storm nights. The heavy oak door had been locked from within, the only key resting in Sir Julian's own pocket. The single window was barred, the chimney too narrow even for a cat. Yet there he lay, his face twisted, his eyes wide, his cane fallen across the flagstones, and though the doctor would later swear there was no mark upon him, Sir Julian Deverell was dead beyond recall. I first heard of it from Superintendent Hadley the next morning in his office at Scotland Yard. The air reeked of tobacco and damp mackintoshes. Hadley stood at the window, scowling out at the mist over the embankment. "You remember Greystone, don't you?" he asked without turning. "Big Gothic pile near Midhurst. Family with too much money and too few heirs. Well, one of them's gone and got himself murdered in a room no one could have entered or left." I said something foolish about locked doors and melodrama, to which Hadley merely grunted. "You'll find this one less amusing when you've seen it. The local men are in a flap. They swear it's suicide, but blast it all, there's no weapon. Not a bruise, not a trace. And the servants were outside that door from the moment they heard him cry out." He turned then, his square face grim. "I've wired Dr. Fell. He's already on his way." Dr. Gideon Fell, whose portly figure, immense intellect, and thunderous laugh were as familiar to Hadley as his own reflection, arrived that afternoon in a swirl of cape, scarf, and good cheer. His cane thumped across the flagstones of Greystone's entrance hall while water dripped from his hat brim. "My dear Hadley," he wheezed between chuckles, "I see your Scotland Yard still finds the laws of nature inconvenient. Locked rooms, eh? They're as British as plum pudding. Let's have a look before you decide the devil's been at work." It was I, an idle journalist and sometime chronicler of Fell's adventures, who trailed after them through the echoing corridors. The air smelled of polish and mildew, and our footsteps carried up to the vaulted ceiling. Servants hovered like frightened ghosts, whispering that Sir Julian had angered the portrait again. That portrait dominated the East Gallery. A huge canvas in a gilt frame, it showed a dark-eyed cavalier of the Restoration, one Alaric Deverell, who'd been accused of witchcraft in 1662 and hanged by Parliament's order. The artist, tradition said, had gone mad before finishing it. On storm nights, people claimed, the lips in the painting seemed to move. Sir Julian's body lay directly beneath it. His head was tilted back, as though he'd looked up in terror before death. Fell lowered himself to one knee with surprising agility for so vast a man. He touched the hand, sniffed the air, and frowned. No scent of poison. No mark of struggle. Locked door. Key in pocket. The old pattern again, but with a curious flavor. Hadley moved to the door and tested the bolt. Solid as Gibraltar. Window barred, and nobody could have climbed the ivy in that gale. Fell leaned heavily on his cane and squinted at the hearth. Ash, disturbed, yet no fire burned. Dust here and none there. "My dear Hadley, someone's been careful to tidy what shouldn't have been tidied." I watched, bewildered, as he examined the frame of the portrait itself. He prodded the lower edge, then laughed softly. "Oh, very good. The work of a craftsman who thought in terms of illusion." "Did Sir Julian dabble in conjuring tricks?" Hadley blinked. "Conjuring?" He collected curiosities. "That's all. Odd manuscripts, automata, things from the music hall." "Why?" Fell only chuckled again and refused to elaborate. The inquest the following day added more confusion. The medical man swore there was no natural cause of death, no heart failure, no shock sufficient to kill. The servants testified that the cry had come just after the clock struck 9 and that within 15 seconds they had battered the locked door open with a poker. Sir Julian was dead, and the only sound had been a faint rustle from the painting above. Hadley, grim as a bulldog, turned to Fell outside the coroner's court. "It's one of those blasted psychic affairs, mark me. The villagers are in a state, and the press will make it worse. You don't think the portrait—" Fell erupted in laughter so thunderous that passers-by turned. "My dear man, when the impossible happens, it is not the laws of nature that are broken, it is only our understanding of them. There's nothing supernatural in this world except human folly, which is limitless. Let us find out whose folly this was." Thus began the affair of the Whispering Portrait, a case in which no lock was forced, no weapon used, and yet a man was killed under the gaze of painted eyes that seemed, in the flicker of lightning, almost alive. The reader will forgive me if at the time I failed to see what Dr. Fell already glimpsed, for I swear, standing there in that silent gallery, even the storm outside seemed to hold its breath, and behind us, faint and tremulous as a sigh, there came, though I thought it must be imagination, the whisper of a voice from the portrait above the body. The whisper, if it was one, left the hair on my neck stiff as a hedgehog. Hadley growled that we were all on edge and ordered the gallery cleared. They left Sir Julian under a sheet, and we retreated to a low-ceilinged smoking room where the fire hissed like a cat at the rain. Dr. Fell, who had said little in the gallery, lowered himself into a chair with the ceremony of a bishop taking his throne, set his cane across his knees, and contemplated his shoes. His spectacles had fogged. Behind them his eyes were merry and distant. "My dear friends," he wheezed, "in Rome there is a church where the confessional carried a whisper half the nave. In London there is a dome where one gentleman may tell another his sins from 50 feet away, and both be damned for impertinence. And in the less reputable corners of Holborn, a music-hall turn once made a portrait recite the alphabet. We catalogue these things as we must under acoustics, mechanics, and bunkum. But we had better catalogue the living as well as the dead. Who was within hail of that door when the clock struck 9? Hadley, who had his notebook out, ticked off names with the blunt end of his pencil. Butler Nash, outside the gallery with Mrs. Brackett, the housekeeper, and the companion, Miss Evelyn Hart. The nephew, Lionel Deverell, was said to be in the billiards room with Mr. Sarto, the art restorer. The family solicitor, Pember, was in the library, the maid Ellen fetching towels for a leak. The gardener, Cobb, and chauffeur Stiles in the motor house, all accounted for, too well accounted for, if you ask me. Which means, Fell said amiably, that the impossible has been arranged for our benefit. Where is Miss Hart? They brought her. A slight woman with a scholar's stoop and a forthright mouth that now tried to be composed. She had the pale look of one who studies too late, and the storm had left a shine on her hair. I heard Sir Julian cry. "And out," she told us, hands tight together. I was with Mrs. Brackett. We were arguing about the draft in the corridor. We ran to the door at once. It was locked. Mr. Nash fetched the poker from the stand, and he and Mr. Pember struck the lock twice. The bolt snapped. Sir Julian was as you saw him. You were arguing about a draft? Fell pounced mildly. From under the door, perhaps. From the north corridor, she said, surprised. It comes and goes in weather like this. Fell nodded, eyes twinkling, as though the house had politely confirmed something he already knew. He asked no more of her, only whether Sir Julian had enemies. Not enemies, exactly, she said, and colour rose in her face. But Lionel needed money, and Mr. Sir Julian dismissed him twice and rehired him for his expert eye, as he called it. They quarrelled over the portrait. Over the portrait? Hadley rapped. Miss Hart hesitated. Sir Julian believed it unique. Mr. Sarto said the canvas had been rebacked clumsily. He called it butchery. Fell's head came up. Rebacked, eh? Thank you, Miss Hart. You are a model of candor. Mr. Nash, if you please. The butler arrived like a procession, narrow face, narrow shoulders, a manner that would have poured wine to a metronome. He confirmed the timing with dry precision. When Fell asked whether he had ever oiled the hinges of the gallery door, the man blinked in affront. Weakly, sir. Yet they screeched like a barn owl just now, Fell observed cheerfully. In weather like this, sir, Nash said, recovering, even oiled hinges can complain. Quite, said Fell, and inquired if the house possessed a speaking tube system. Nash believed there had once been bells and tubes to old servants' rooms now disused. He recalled, under pressing, a brass mouthpiece high in the north corridor, capped with a little lid. We returned to the gallery, while Hadley sent men to locate the tube. The sheet had been drawn back. The doctor had gone. The portrait loomed above the body like an accusation. Fell, bracing on his cane, raised himself until his nose almost touched the gilt. He breathed on the lower moulding, and a faint cloud ghosted the wood. Dust here, he murmured, swiping a sausage of a finger along the lip. And a clean band there, as though a thin edge had moved. Moved? I repeated stupidly. Or been moved, he said. He tapped the frame. Somewhere inside answered a softened, hollow knock that might have been the echo of a cupboard. Dear me, Hadley prowled like a tethered bull. If you're hinting there's a cupboard behind this damned canvas, there isn't. I've had men on the other side of the wall. It's solid stone. Stone in front, Fell corrected mildly. Behind, well. Let us not tell the fairy story before the moral. He pointed to the hearth. Ash, disturbed. No fire laid, poker absent until it obligingly reappears as a battering ram, had its soot on it when they fetched it. I had not noticed. Hadley swore and sent for it. When Nash produced the poker, Fell turned it in his hands, peering at the knob, then sniffed. Cold iron, he said. It had not seen a grate that night. He peered next at the key, still bagged by the constable, a blunt, old-fashioned thing taken from Sir Julian's pocket. And this, he said, hasn't seen much use either. The bolt shows new scarring, but the key's ward is clean. You will oblige me, Hadley, by not deciding yet which object locked the door. Miss Hart, who had lingered, gave a small cry. But what else could have? Locked rooms, said Fell, beaming on her, are like stage curtains. They conceal the scene change more than the scene. At that instant, a constable called from the corridor. He had found the brass mouthpiece halfway up the wall, its lid askew, its tubing vanishing into darkness. Fell clambered with surprising eagerness to investigate. He cupped a hand to it, then beckoned me. Speak, my lad. Feeling a fool, I murmured. Hallo. From somewhere, faint but distinct, came my own voice, smaller and uncanny. Hallo, as though a child inside the wall mocked me. Fell's eyes shone. A whispering house, he said. An old one, undisciplined, but a whispering house. That, Hadley, is not a ghost. It is a road. A road to what? Hadley demanded. To a place, Fell said, where a man may be made to believe he hears what is not there. Add to it a locked door that was perhaps never truly locked, and a portrait whose lower edge has done more work than is expected of fine art. But we still lack the human reason, the motive, the hand. We must meet Mr. Lionel Deverell and Mr. Sarto together. We must hear what they quarrelled about, and when. And one other detail. Hadley, who wound the long case clock in the gallery this evening. Hadley stared. What in blazes has the clock? Time, Fell said gently, is the best accomplice. It will betray anyone who tries to bully it. He levered himself upright, puffing like a grampus. Come along. Let us ask questions with our eyes as well as our tongues. Lionel Deverell met them in the library, his hand still bandaged from some minor cut, and his eyes defiant with the self-consciousness of guilt denied. The light of the desk lamp cut sharp angles across his face, and his cigarette trembled as he spoke. "I've told you all I know," he said. "I was with Sato in the billiards room the whole time." "He'll confirm it." Hadley's tone was even but edged. "And the quarrel with your uncle about the portrait?" "You might as well be frank, sir." Lionel gave a short laugh that had no mirth in it. "He was an old fool about that painting. He called it our family's soul. He was convinced it whispered warnings. I said it whispered mildew. He threw a glass at me." Dr. Fell chuckled, filling the silence that followed. "A difference of aesthetic, eh? But what precisely did you quarrel over, my boy? The authenticity, perhaps?" "Authenticity?" Lionel said, glancing up sharply. "Yes," Sato insisted the portrait wasn't by Lely at all. He claimed it was a later copy, rebacked and disguised. Uncle wouldn't hear of it. He was ready to write Sato out of his will. I told him he was being absurd. That's all." "And the will?" Fell wheezed. "Was it altered?" "Not yet. But he meant to. Tonight. His solicitor, Pember, was here for that very purpose." Hadley and I exchanged a look. Fell's eyes gleamed behind his misted spectacles. "Then the motive grows as fine as a cobweb. But tell me, do you recall what time the clock struck when you heard the cry?" 9, precisely, Lionel said. "The storm had just begun. I remember the lights flickered." "Indeed," murmured Fell. "And yet the clock in the gallery was wound that evening?" "Yes, by Nash, I suppose. He always does." The conversation was interrupted by a loud clatter. The door had opened to admit Mr. Sato himself, a lean, nervous Italian in a paint-stained smock, hair brushed back as if in permanent agitation. He started when he saw the policeman and laughed uneasily. "I am sorry, gentlemen. I hear you speak my name. Yes? I am not accused, I hope?" "That remains to be seen," Hadley said shortly. "You can confirm, Mr. Lionel's statement that you were together at the time of the death?" Sato spread his hands. "Together, yes. We played billiards. I lost. I am terrible. At the time of the scream bar. I remember." The lights blinked. He dropped the cue. We ran together to the gallery. Fell's voice was mild but probing. "And you had previously been employed to restore the portrait?" The artist grimaced. "Once. Yes. It was, how you say, ungrateful work. The canvas is strange, patched at the back like a beggar's coat. But your Sir Julian, he loved it like a wife. When I say it was not by Lely, he throws me out. Then, months later, he calls me again, for the varnish, he says. Always this painting, this face. It was an obsession." Fell puffed on his pipe, staring into nothing. "And when you cleaned it, Mr. Sato, did you ever notice the lower edge, the frame, perhaps had been tampered with?" "Tampered?" Sato frowned. "Ah, yes. There is a joint that lifts slightly when you move the picture. I thought it from damp." Hadley scribbled furiously. Fell only nodded, apparently satisfied. A servant entered then to announce that the long-case clock had been examined. The mechanism was ordinary enough, but the pendulum was stopped, the hands arrested at 9, though the spring was still half-wound. Fell thanked him absently and turned to Hadley. "We must next see that solicitor. There's always mischief near a pen and ink." Pember was waiting in the study, a short, barrel-chested man with bristling eyebrows and the calm of someone who thrives on documents rather than people. He spoke crisply, without sentiment. "Sir Julian intended to sign a new will tonight." "Yes." He was determined. "I brought the drafts, but he insisted we delay until after supper. He wanted to think. I left him in the gallery at 8:30. That's the last I saw of him alive." "You locked no door behind you?" Fell asked. "Certainly not. He dismissed me himself." "And no one else approached the gallery while you were there?" "No one. I met Miss Hart in the corridor a few minutes later, then went to the library. The storm began, and soon after that he broke off, swallowing. Well, you know the rest." For a time Fell said nothing. He stared at the solicitor as if studying a book's spine, his lips pursed. Then, abruptly, he leaned forward. "Mr. Pember, you said the new will was not yet signed. Where is it now?" "In my briefcase. Locked." "Why?" Fell's hand struck his cane on the floor. "Because if someone wished to keep the old will alive, they had better kill before the ink dries. But there's more here than inheritance. The portrait, its frame, the whispering tubes, the stopped clock, they are part of one machine. Someone knew exactly how to make sound travel and fear kill faster than any knife." Hadley stared. "You think the man was frightened to death?" Fell's laugh rolled like thunder in the chimney. "My dear Hadley, men die of fear only in books and cheap sermons. No, our victim was murdered, and the weapon was invisible only because we have not yet looked in the right direction. But I promise you this. Before we leave Greystone Hall, we shall make the portrait whisper again, and this time it shall name the killer." The fire flickered, the storm beat at the panes, and though I told myself it was imagination, the canvas in the distant gallery seemed, for an instant, to shiver like living flesh. The next morning dawned in a watery grey, the kind of reluctant daylight that made even the walls of Greystone seem to flinch from their own shadows. Rain still trailed across the windows, though the storm's worst fury had passed. We gathered once more in the East Gallery, where the portrait of Alaric Deverell hung in mute defiance above the black-draped shape that had been Sir Julian. The house was restless. Servants whispered of resignations, and Miss Hart looked as though she had not slept. Dr. Fell, by contrast, appeared in high spirits, hat askew, scarf trailing like a banner, eyes twinkling through misted lenses. "Hadley, my dear fellow," he boomed, thumping his cane upon the tiles. "We must be grateful to the elements. Rain has a habit of washing away nonsense, even when it's in the human brain. Let us see if it's cleaned any from yours or mine." Hadley grunted, but his eyes were alert. "We've done as you asked." The clock was examined thoroughly. "There's nothing abnormal, except that it stopped at 9. The weights are sound. The pendulum unbroken." Fell's broad face creased in a smile. "Stopped at 9, precisely when the household heard the cry. So either the clock keeps an extraordinary sympathy for its master's demise, or someone stopped it deliberately to fix a time. Tell me, Hadley, what happens when the mainspring of such a clock is checked suddenly? It gives a small jerk, might stop the pendulum if you held it." Hadley said. "But why would anyone?" "Exactly," Fell barked, delighted. "Why indeed, unless the time of death had to appear certain when it was not. Fix the clock at 9, create a noise, and there you are, the locked room illusion born like a conjurer's rabbit." Lionel, who stood at the far end of the gallery with folded arms, gave a sharp laugh. "You mean to say someone faked the moment of his death, while the rest of us were elsewhere?" "Patience, my boy, patience," Fell said, lowering himself into a chair with a sigh. "We know the room was locked from within, but we also know, thanks to our nocturnal discoveries, that the house possesses a whispering tube system. Now imagine, if you will, that the mouthpiece outside this gallery connects to a chamber below or beside it. A man there could whisper or shout into the tube, and it would sound as though it came from this very wall. That, my dear Hadley, may account for the ghostly voice and the servant's illusion that Sir Julian called out." "But what about the door?" I ventured. "It was locked." "Locked? Yes, but when?" Fell's voice had dropped into that rumbling gentleness which made one listen the harder. "You recall the key in the pocket? Clean ward. Fresh scarring on the bolt. The poker used to break the lock had no soot upon it. Therefore, it was fetched before the cry was heard, before anyone had reason to believe. The door was locked. Why would the butler carry a cold poker from a different room, unless someone planned that lock would jam precisely at the right moment?" Hadley frowned, rubbing his chin. "Meaning Nash himself? Or one acting under his direction?" Fell said softly. "But motive first. Miss Hart, You told us yesterday Sir Julian intended to sign a new will, disinheriting his nephew. Would you happen to know who witnessed the previous one? Miss Hart's voice was unsteady but clear. I did. And Mr. Nash. Sir Julian trusted us both. Then you and Nash were the only two whose signatures would appear on a legal document he meant to destroy. Interesting. Fell rose heavily and approached the portrait. The morning light caught on the painted lips, still faintly gleaming from years of varnish. If one wished to make a man believe a ghost was warning him or accusing him, this would serve well. The whispering tube could carry a voice here, behind this frame, where it emerges as if from Alaric Deverell's painted mouth. Picture the scene. The lights flicker. The storm howls. The old man stares up and hears his ancestor speak. Lionel's face went white. You think someone frightened him to death? No, said Fell gravely. I think someone killed him afterward. Fear may have weakened his heart, but it was human cunning that finished the job. Yet the weapon, the true means, still eludes us, and that Hadley is intolerable. He turned suddenly to the butler, who had just entered with tea. Nash, a question. Did Sir Julian keep any medical draughts, tonics, sleeping mixtures, that sort of thing? Yes, sir. A heart medicine prescribed in London. It was on the table near him last night. Still there? I believe so. Fetch it, please. When Nash returned, Fell examined the bottle closely. His eyes brightened. A powder residue clings to the glass rim, yet the label reads, drops only. Hadley, have this tested. If someone replaced the medicine with powdered aconite or digitalis, our miracle will become a simple murder. Simple but beautifully staged. Hadley nodded, grim satisfaction replacing doubt. And whoever handled that bottle will have left traces, even if the storm washed the rest away. Fell leaned back, puffing contentedly on his pipe. Yes, yes, we approach daylight, my friends. But until we understand how our murderer could appear to speak from a painting and vanish from a locked room, we have only half the truth. Tonight we'll make the portrait whisper again, and see which of the living trembles most. At that, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling them like a giant's breath. I could not help but glance toward the portrait, whose eyes seemed just for a flickering instant to look down at us all in mocking amusement. The laboratory results came back by early afternoon, and the news sent a visible tremor through the house. The residue from Sir Julian's medicine bottle contained powdered digitalis in lethal concentration enough to kill within minutes. Hadley received the report with grim satisfaction and read it aloud before the hearth in the study. So, there's our method. Poison in his draught, taken just before 9, and since no one entered after that, the killer must have administered it earlier in the evening. We'll find which of the household handled the bottle, and the rest will fall into place. Dr. Fell, however, seemed less jubilant. He sat, puffing his pipe in silence, his eyes half closed behind the fog of smoke. Too neat, Hadley, too precise, he muttered. Poison is a subtle trick, but it doesn't explain the impossible circumstances. The whispering portrait still stands unanswered. Hadley frowned. We've established the whispering tube connects from the north corridor. If the murderer wanted to frighten Sir Julian, they could easily have spoken through it. Nash knew the system best. That gives him motive, means, and opportunity. Perhaps, Fell said softly, but remember, the poison could be given only by someone whom Sir Julian trusted. He was a cautious man. He'd take medicine only from his own hand or from one he believed incapable of betrayal. That thought hung in the room like smoke. Miss Evelyn Hart was standing near the window, her face pale. She turned sharply. You can't mean surely you don't think I? No, my dear young lady, Fell said kindly. I think only that Sir Julian's habits and fears make the problem sharper. The bottle was last seen on the table by his chair. Yes? But when the servants broke in, it had been moved to the writing desk near the portrait. Who placed it there? That is the question we must answer before we hang a man or woman. Lionel, restless and ashen, burst out. "If Nash touched that bottle, we'll have his fingerprints, surely." "We shall," Hadley said, his voice tight. "But we must also consider motive." Nash stood to gain nothing. "You, on the other hand," Lionel's face darkened. "I had no need to murder my uncle. He hadn't signed the new will. I'd inherit everything anyway." "Exactly," Fell interrupted, slapping his cane on the floor. "You had no need, so why not ensure the will remained unsigned? But no. This won't do. The clock, the door, the whisper, these are not the work of greed alone. They are theatre. Someone in this house loves artifice, and theatre requires rehearsal." At that, Hadley's eyes lit. Sato, the artist. He restored that portrait. He'd know every inch of it, and he's a man with flair for drama. Fell smiled faintly. "A logical suspicion. Shall we test it?" They found Sato in the conservatory, pacing amid the ferns. The air was thick with damp and the faint metallic scent of paint thinner. He looked up nervously as we entered. "You bring more questions, yes?" "Always questions." Fell approached him slowly. "Only one, my friend. When you worked on the portrait, you mentioned a joint along the lower edge. Did it open?" Sato hesitated. "A little. It is not a joint, it is like a small panel, only an inch deep. When lifted, there is space behind the frame." Fell's face brightened. "Space enough for what?" "For nothing. A few wires, perhaps. I did not explore. Sir Julian told me to leave it sealed." "Wires?" Fell echoed softly. "Curious. And yet, there was no electricity feeding the portrait. You see, my dear Hadley, how every question births another. Someone made use of that cavity." Sato's hands trembled. "You think I am a fool, not a killer." "No, not a fool," Fell said gently. "A craftsman, perhaps too trusting. Tell me, Sato, who last stood beside you while you worked on that painting?" "Miss Hart," he whispered. "She watched me every day." All eyes turned to her, but Fell raised a hand. "No accusations yet. The truth hides behind smaller doors than these. Hadley, we shall recreate the event tonight. The same room, same stormlight if the weather blesses us, and the same clock striking 9. We shall make the portrait whisper once more. Then," he smiled, eyes gleaming, "then we shall see whose courage falters when the dead man's voice returns." The house fell silent, save for the ticking of the hall clock. Outside, thunder rolled distantly across the downs, as if the heavens themselves approved the plan. Evening fell over Greystone with the slow, heavy tread of inevitability. The house stood hushed, as though listening for the reenactment that Dr. Fell had decreed. Candles had been placed along the corridor, their flickering light reflected in the polished armor of forgotten ancestors. In the East Gallery, every trace of the day's investigation had been tidied away, the draped form removed, the furniture restored to its former positions. Only the portrait remained, that brooding rectangle of shadow and eyes, fixed eternally on the space where Sir Julian had died. Hadley directed the preparations with his usual brisk precision, though he muttered that Fell's methods bordered on pantomime. Miss Hart sat pale and silent in a chair near the hearth, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Sato stood behind her, shifting from foot to foot like a man under sentence. Lionel paced restlessly, his cigarette ash dropping unheeded on the carpet. Even Nash, that impassive butler, betrayed unease, his collar wilted, his eyes avoiding Fell's entirely. Dr. Fell surveyed them all with the satisfaction of a ringmaster whose stage is finally set. "We shall have light enough to see, and dark enough to imagine," he said cheerfully, lowering himself into an armchair with a groan. "You will each take your former place as nearly as possible. Hadley, you and I will remain observers. The rest of you try to remember your positions at 9 o'clock last night. Every gesture matters." The wind clawed again at the shutters, as if mocking the reconstruction. Nash extinguished the electric lamp so that only the candles and the dim hearth remained. In that uneasy glow, The portrait's expression seemed to change. Its painted mouth curved almost imperceptibly into a sneer. At Fell's signal, Nash stepped into the corridor to stand near the brass mouthpiece of the whispering tube. Sato lingered near the window, and Lionel moved to the billiards room doorway where he claimed to have been when the cry sounded. Miss Hart, visibly trembling, took her seat near the gallery entrance. "Now then," Fell said, his deep voice filling the silence. "We imagine it is last night. Sir Julian sits there, by the fire. He pours his medicine. Outside, the storm rises. Miss Hart, you were speaking with Mrs. Brackett about the draft." "Yes," she murmured. "Just there, by the corridor door." "Excellent. You hear the clock strike 9, so?" Fell motioned to Hadley, who wound the long case clock and set the pendulum swinging. The mechanism ticked solemnly, marking the seconds. "And then," Fell continued, "comes the cry. But tonight, we shall have a different kind of ghost." He turned his gaze toward the corridor. "Mr. Nash, at your convenience." There followed a brief pause. Then, out of nowhere, the sound came. A whisper, faint yet distinct, seeming to bloom from the very air of the gallery. It was not a human whisper so much as a breath shaped into words. "Julian," it sighed. "Beware the portrait." Miss Hart gave a strangled cry. Sato cursed softly and crossed himself. Even Hadley swore under his breath. The voice seemed to drift from the painted mouth itself, echoing in the high rafters. Fell's eyes gleamed. "Ah, you hear it, gentlemen, the whisper of the damned," so they called it. "And yet it comes not from the dead, but from a living man with clever fingers and a knowledge of physics. Now, Mr. Nash, be so good as to join us." The butler entered slowly, his face grey. "It was I, sir, who spoke into the tube as you instructed." "Indeed," said Fell. "But last night someone else did precisely the same. The difference is that the voice then was timed with the striking of the clock and the flash of lightning. It was meant to terrify Sir Julian into looking upward, into believing his ancestor warned him. And at that moment, while he stared at the painting, the poison he had already taken began to work. Our murderer didn't need to be in the room at all." Hadley's eyes widened. "Then the cry we heard wasn't his?" "No," Fell said softly. "It was the murderer's signal, the voice through the tube, a final, mocking flourish. The key detail lies in the clock, Hadley. It stopped at 9 because the pendulum was halted by someone's hand earlier, fixing the time of death before the event. And the poker, remember, was fetched cold long before the door was broken. The scene was orchestrated. Miss Hart's breathing quickened. But who could plan such a monstrous deception? The same person who tended Sir Julian's medicines, who witnessed his will, and who knew how the whispering system worked." Fell said, rising heavily. His gaze settled on the butler, whose composure was cracking like ice. "Mr. Nash." Nash's lips trembled, but he made no sound. Fell went on gently, almost pitying. "You served him faithfully for 30 years, and he promised you a pension that never came. He meant to dismiss you after the new will, and you knew it. So you poisoned his medicine and used the whisper to make him look mad, haunted by his ancestor. You staged the locked room farce with the key and the poker. But one small flaw betrayed you. The scarring on the bolt and the cleaned key. You forced the lock from outside to make it seem broken, forgetting that only the inside bolt would show such marks." Nash swayed, gripping the table for support. "I never meant," he gasped. "Men rarely do," Fell said gravely. "But they mean enough." Hadley stepped forward, placing a hand on the butler's shoulder. Outside, thunder rolled once more, as though marking the end of the performance. For a long moment, no one spoke. The candles guttered, casting distorted shadows across Nash's stricken face. The butler stood rigid, his hands gripping the table as if it alone kept him upright. Outside, the wind moaned through the chimneys, that hollow lament peculiar to old houses and old sins. Hadley's grip tightened on the man's shoulder. "You'd best speak now, Nash," he said quietly. "Doctor, Fell's put the pieces together, but it's your last chance to tell us how." Nash swallowed, his voice a rasp. It wasn't meant to be murder. He'd have died quietly in his chair, no one the wiser. But when I saw him look at the fat portrait like a frightened child, I panicked. I thought if I made him seem mad, if they believed he'd poisoned himself out of fear, no one would suspect. The whisper was just to finish the illusion. "Poisoned himself?" Fell repeated softly, stepping forward. "Ah, yes. The perfect alibi for a servant, a loyal retainer shocked by his master's despair. But the trouble with perfect lies, Nash, is that they must withstand impossible facts. And facts, my dear man, have a devilish way of enduring." Nash's eyes darted toward Miss Hart, who sat frozen, white as marble. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "He was cruel, sir. Dismissed servants without warning. Mocked me before the others. I gave him comfort for years, and he treated me like the furniture. I thought one dose, quick and quiet, and all his fine talk about ghosts would serve me in the end." Hadley's voice was rough but steady. "And the key? The door?" "The key was easy," Nash said, almost pleading. "He always left it on the table. I took it after supper, locked the door from outside, and dropped it into his coat pocket while everyone crowded round the body. The bolt marks well. I'd struck it once before they came, to make it seem jammed." Hadley exhaled, grimly satisfied. "That matches the evidence." But Fell was still frowning. His thick brows drew together, and a strange light came into his eyes, half pity, half suspicion. "You see, Hadley," he murmured, "our butler's confession explains everything except the one thing that cannot be explained away." Hadley turned sharply. "And what's that?" "The whisper," Fell said. "Not the one Nash made tonight, but the first, the one that called out after Sir Julian had already fallen dead." The silence returned, heavier than before. Even Nash looked startled. "But I never—" "No," Fell interrupted, his voice deep and resonant now. "You never did, for you were in the corridor when the servants broke in, shouting like a man possessed. You could not have spoken through the tube at that moment. Yet a whisper was heard again, faint, lingering after the door was forced. Someone else used the device then. Someone who wanted the illusion complete." Hadley stared. "Then Nash didn't act alone?" "Precisely." Fell's cane thumped once on the floor. "There was another hand in this, a mind that improved upon the butler's clumsy attempt and gave it the polish of genius. Ask yourself who had access to the portrait after Nash. Who was in the corridor while he fetched help? Who knew that the voice, heard again after Sir Julian's death, would seal the legend and divert suspicion from every living soul?" All eyes turned, slowly, toward Miss Evelyn Hart. She flinched under their gaze, her composure cracking. "You can't mean me," she said hoarsely. What reason could I possibly have?" Fell regarded her kindly but without mercy. "The oldest reason of all, my dear. Love and disappointment. You loved Sir Julian's nephew, yet Sir Julian despised the idea. He meant to cut Lionel off entirely, and you with him. When you learned Nash's desperate plan, you saw how easily it could be turned to your advantage. You didn't poison the old man, but when he collapsed, you took your chance to speak into the tube. You gave voice to his phantom, made it seem as though his own ancestor cursed him, and secured the illusion of madness. That single whisper saved Nash from suspicion, and you from ruin until now." Lionel sprang forward. "That's a lie," he shouted. "Evelyn say it's a lie." Her lips trembled, but no sound came. Then, suddenly, she rose, her chair toppling behind her. "I didn't mean it to go so far," she cried. "He was already dead. I thought if they believed the curse killed him, they'd never suspect. Lionel would inherit. We could start anew." "I only," whispered once. "I swear it!" Fell bowed his head. "The devil's arithmetic, my dear. One whisper more or less, and a man is damned. Hadley moved toward her slowly. I'm afraid that's the truth of it. She looked at Lionel, eyes wide, imploring, but he had turned away, his face hidden in his hands. The moment stretched like the hush before a storm's breaking. Then Miss Hart gave a small, broken laugh that was more a sob and sank back into her chair. Outside, the wind fell silent at last, and only the clock in the gallery could be heard ticking a slow, mournful witness to human folly. The confession lingered in the air, like the fading echo of that final whisper. No one moved for several heartbeats. Miss Hart sat motionless, hands pressed to her face, her shoulders trembling. Lionel stood apart, rigid, staring into the fire as if trying to burn the memory of her words from his mind. Hadley, grim and businesslike, took a step forward but hesitated when Fell raised a massive hand. Wait, Fell said softly. We have truth, yes, but not the whole of it. Miss Hart's act was desperate, but not the design. There remains a thread unpulled, a motive deeper than love or panic. There is still a secret in this house, Hadley, and it lies behind that portrait. The remark sent a faint ripple through the room. Even Nash, whose head had sunk into his hands, looked up sharply. Fell lumbered toward the painting, the cane's ferrule tapping against the stones. He studied the gilt frame with almost affectionate attention, as though greeting an old adversary. Remember, my friends, he went on, the whispering tube was not installed for murder. It is an antique curiosity, part of the original design of Greystone. Yet someone long before last night tampered with the portrait. Sato discovered the small panel, the hidden space, and the wires. Wires, he said. Why should there be wires behind a 17th century canvas? Sato's eyes widened as he nodded quickly. Yes, yes. I saw them when I lifted the frame. They led downward, vanished into the wall itself. I thought it strange, but Sir Julian forbade me to touch them. Precisely, Fell exclaimed. Sir Julian knew. He feared it. That is why he became obsessed with the painting, because he suspected what lay behind it. He did not believe in ghosts, but he feared human deceit, and that, gentlemen, is what truly frightened him to death. Hadley frowned. Then someone besides Nash and Miss Hart had an interest in keeping him silent. Fell's expression sobered. Yes, the true author of this business. Sir Julian discovered that the portrait had been altered not by Sato, but by someone before him, someone who used that hidden cavity to conceal documents, something that, if found, would have destroyed a fortune. At this, Lionel turned from the hearth, his voice low and strained. What are you implying? That my uncle hid something there? Not hid uncovered, Fell said gravely. You see, the original portrait was rebacked 50 years ago, but when Sato examined it, he noticed that the new lining was crudely done. I examined it myself earlier today. The paint on the lower edge is fresher than the rest, as if replaced. That was not Sato's work, it was someone else's, done years ago to hide a compartment built into the wall. Sir Julian learned that a false panel existed and that something was sealed inside. He meant to open it, and that is why he died. Hadley's tone sharpened. And what was in it? Let us find out, Fell said, and, grasping the lower edge of the frame, he lifted. The great painting swung outward on concealed hinges with a slow groan. Behind it yawned a narrow recess in the stone, dusty, dark, but not empty. Fell reached in and drew out a bundle of papers, bound in faded ribbon. The topmost sheet bore the Deverell seal. For a moment, only the sound of rain filled the gallery. Then Fell laid the bundle on the table. A will, he murmured, dated 30 years ago, naming not Sir Julian but Lionel's father as heir, and more letters, receipts, proofs of misappropriated funds. Sir Julian discovered his family fortune had been built on fraud. To reveal it would ruin the estate. Someone decided he must not speak. Hadley's jaw tightened. You think, Lionel? But Fell shook his head. No, the poor lad didn't know. But there was one who'd managed the accounts for decades, one who knew both the secret and the passageways of this house. He turned slowly toward the butler. Nash. The old servant gave a strangled cry. No, that those papers, he swore he'd destroy them. He promised. Ah, Fell said gently, so he found them years ago, did he? And when Sir Julian began probing, you feared discovery. You poisoned him to keep your thefts hidden, but Miss Hart's whisper turned your selfish act into a legend. The impossible crime was born from two desperate people acting in ignorance of each other. Hadley moved swiftly, the handcuffs gleaming in the candlelight. Nash did not resist. His strength seemed to drain away entirely. He muttered something about loyalty, about years of service gone unrewarded, and then slumped into a chair. Miss Hart had begun to weep quietly. Fell placed a heavy hand upon her shoulder, his voice now almost fatherly. My dear, your folly was born of fear, not malice. The law may temper mercy with understanding, but it cannot forget. Hadley signaled the constable at the door. Take him to the village station. We'll have the papers sealed and sent to London. As the door closed behind them, the gallery fell into silence once more. The portrait hung open, the ghost within revealed as nothing more than greed and deceit. Fell stood before it, cane in hand, breathing heavily but smiling faintly. There, he said, the whispering portrait has been silenced at last, and as I've told you before, Hadley, when the impossible happens, it is only because someone took pains to make it look that way. The arrest of Nash brought a strange stillness to Greystone Hall. The echo of boots faded down the corridor, leaving behind the faint scent of candle smoke and damp wool. Miss Hart sat motionless by the dying fire, her eyes fixed on nothing, while Lionel stood beside the open portrait, staring at the hidden cavity that had undone them all. The rain outside had softened to a mist, tapping gently against the windows like hesitant fingers. Doctor. Fell remained where he was, one vast hand resting on his cane, the other rummaging through the old papers with the care of an archivist examining relics of guilt. His expression was not triumphant, but melancholy, touched by a scholar's grief for human folly. It is always the same, he murmured. Man builds his prisons out of secrets. Once they're sealed behind paint and oak, they grow claws. Hadley, his face drawn but composed, glanced toward the door where the constables had taken Nash. You've settled it, Fell. Nash poisoned him, stole the fortune, and buried the proof. That's an end to it. An end? Fell repeated mildly. There's never an end. My dear Hadley, only the point where understanding begins. For instance, how did Sir Julian come to suspect there was anything behind the portrait at all? That question has teeth. Hadley frowned. Sato's work, perhaps. He loosened the frame. Ah, but Sato himself, said the old man, warned him not to tamper with it. Fell tapped the bundle of papers. No, Sir Julian knew something long before that restoration. Something, or someone, led him to look here. Lionel, who had been silent, spoke suddenly, his voice hoarse. There was a letter, a few weeks ago. He mentioned it at supper, the only time he ever talked freely with me. Said he'd had a message from a friend of the family who claimed to know where an injustice still lay buried. I thought it was some crank. He tore the letter up. Fell's round eyes brightened behind the fog of his spectacles. A letter, eh? Do you recall anything more about it? The handwriting? The postmark? Only that it was typed, Lionel said. And the envelope bore the London seal. Hadley grunted. If Nash intercepted Sir Julian's mail, he might have written it himself. Fell shook his head. Too dangerous. Nash was clever but not imaginative. No, this was the work of someone who wanted Sir Julian to look, someone who wanted him to find these papers. He turned to Miss Hart, whose face was hidden in her hands. Miss Hart, you corresponded with Lionel from London before coming here, did you not? Her head lifted slowly. Yes, she said faintly, but I never wrote to Sir Julian. No, but you might have mentioned the restoration, or the portrait's strange condition. Words overheard, repeated in the wrong ears, may rouse sleeping ghosts. Fell's gaze softened. Who else knew of your journey to Greystone? Who might have learned that the portrait was being examined? She hesitated, then whispered, I told my cousin. He works at the same gallery as Mr. Sato sometimes. I thought nothing of it. Fell gave a low chuckle that sounded almost like a sigh. Ah, the spider's web grows clearer. Someone, perhaps your cousin, perhaps one of his employers, learned that Sir Julian was investigating the painting. If those papers ever reached daylight, certain gentlemen in London would find their reputations less secure than they appear. And so, a whisper reached Nash's ear, a warning that his thefts were in danger. He struck first. Hadley leaned back with a scowl. But we'll never trace that far. The source could be anyone. True, Fell said, but the moral remains. Greystone was merely the last act in a very old play. The portrait, the poison, the whisper, all tools of men too clever for their own good. He closed the bundle with care, tying the ribbon once more. Let the Yard keep these safe. They'll hang Nash and silence the rest. But history, my dear Hadley, will not forget that this family killed itself long before any poison touched its veins. Lionel stepped forward, his voice unsteady. And what of Evelyn? She didn't kill him. Surely, she will be charged, Hadley said gently. Her interference made the crime what it was. Miss Hart turned toward Fell, her eyes glistening in the firelight. Dr. Fell, she said softly. Will they believe that I meant no harm, that I only tried to protect the man I loved? Fell's great form seemed to sag for a moment, like a monument under its own weight. They will believe, he said kindly, because it is true. But truth does not always spare us its consequences. Remember that the first lie in any crime is the one we tell ourselves. Outside, the rain ceased entirely, leaving a silence so pure it seemed unnatural. The last candle flickered and went out. Hadley cleared his throat and said, Come, Fell, we've work yet at the station. Fell turned once more to the portrait, now hanging ajar with its secret cavity exposed. A fine painting, he mused. A whispering ghost that spoke only the language of guilt. If ever you hear of a family portrait again, Hadley, take my advice. Have the wall behind it measured. He gave a wheezing chuckle, then moved toward the door. His cane struck the floor with steady rhythm, the sound echoing long after he had gone, mingling with the faint sigh of wind through the open chimney. A whisper, perhaps, but no longer one of the dead. The following morning broke with a pale, colorless light that seemed to leach the very soul from Greystone Hall. The mist had settled low over the downs, and from the windows one could barely see the edge of the drive. The servants moved quietly, as if the house itself were in mourning for its master, while Hadley and I made preparations to depart for London with the evidence. Dr. Fell, however, lingered in the gallery, puffing his pipe and staring up at the great portrait whose painted eyes had witnessed so much deceit. He looked older in that moment. I thought his vast frame sagging under invisible weight, his humor dimmed to a faint ember. There's always something unfinished about these things, he muttered, almost to himself. The law deals in guilt, but the heart... the heart deals in tragedy. Hadley joined him, glancing uneasily at the painting. You're not having doubts, are you, Fell? We've got enough to see Nash hanged twice over. Doubts? Fell's tone was mild. No, Hadley. Certainties. I was thinking only that Nash's motive was not entirely greed. He was protecting a sin older than himself, the rotted root of this family tree. But I've no doubt of the facts. He poisoned the man, and the rest of you, poor souls, added the embroidery. Hadley grunted. Then I'll be glad to be shut of the place. I never liked houses that whisper at you. Fell chuckled, though the sound was low and tired. It isn't the house that whispers, my dear fellow, it's people. Houses only echo back what's been said within their walls. By noon the constables had departed with their prisoner. Miss Hart, under Hadley's escort, was taken to the carriage for the journey to London. She looked small and lost beneath her veil, and when she passed Fell, she paused. "You've been kind," she said softly. "Even in judgment." Fell bowed deeply, his voice gentle. "If kindness can be found in truth, my dear, then it belongs to you. I only hope time will teach you that love is never bought by concealment. The truth always arrives, whether we open the door or it breaks it down." She nodded faintly and turned away, her steps echoing down the long corridor until the sound was swallowed by distance. When the last carriage wheels had faded into the mist, the house felt impossibly large and hollow. The staff kept to the servants' wing, whispering in corners, avoiding the gallery where the portrait hung. I joined Fell there once more, drawn by a strange compulsion. The morning had left a thin chill, and the portrait, now rehung against the bare stone, seemed to brood over the silence like a sentinel. Fell stood before it, pipe unlit, his head bowed slightly. "I told you before," he said, without looking round, "that the impossible crime is merely the simplest one with its reasoning turned inside out. But what makes a mystery endure is not the method, it's the emotion behind it. The locked door, the whispering voice, the poisoned glass. All these were only reflections of what lay inside the human mind." I watched him in silence, aware that his words were not meant only for me. He went on. "Consider, if you will, the irony. Sir Julian's ancestors cheated to build their wealth, and he, in exposing that fraud, condemned himself. Nash feared disgrace more than sin and killed to prevent it. Miss Hart loved a man enough to falsify a ghost. Every one of them acted to preserve something: status, love, pride, and in so doing destroyed it utterly. That, my boy, is the anatomy of all impossible crimes." He turned toward me, his face softened by the pale light. "When you write this down, and I know you will, don't make the ghost too loud, nor the villain too black. Leave a little mercy in it. After all, ghosts and villains are much the same. The only difference is that one cannot repent." Outside, the mist began to lift, revealing the lawns slick with rain and the faint shimmer of sunlight beyond the hedgerows. Fell glanced once more at the portrait, then tapped his cane lightly on the floor. "Hadley's waiting. Best we leave these walls to their silence. They've earned it." We made our way through the echoing corridors toward the entrance hall. The great clock ticked solemnly once more, repaired and running, as if defying the memory of its deceit. Fell paused beside it, inspecting the polished case. "You see, my friend," he said with a smile, "time always resumes its proper rhythm once the lies are removed." As we stepped out into the damp air, the heavy doors closing behind us, I turned for one last glance. Through the glass panes of the entrance, I saw the faint reflection of the portrait down the corridor, a glimmer of its painted eyes catching the light. For an instant, absurdly, I thought they looked relieved. Dr. Fell followed my gaze and gave one final booming laugh that rolled across the courtyard like distant thunder. "Superstition dies hard," he said, "but reason, thank heaven, never does." He adjusted his hat, tucked his scarf tighter about his neck, and strode toward the waiting motor car with a kind of ponderous dignity. The mist swirled around him, parting briefly as if the very air acknowledged his passage. And as the engine started and we drove down the long, winding road away from Greystone Hall, I looked back once more. The great house receded into the fog, its windows dark and unseeing, its secrets finally laid to rest. Yet in the quiet hum of the car, I could still hear Fell's words echoing in my mind, his calm, unshakable faith that even the most impossible crime must, in the end, surrender to the light of reason. The journey back to London was a quiet one. The countryside slid past under a pale, uncertain sun, the mist thinning into a memory of rain. Hadley sat opposite Dr. Fell in the motor car, his hands clasped on his knees, his eyes fixed on the blurred horizon. For once, he had nothing to say. The weight of the Greystone affair seemed to press upon both men, and even Fell's pipe remained unlit, his round face thoughtful beneath the brim of his hat. I sat beside the driver, but the murmured hum of their conversation soon drew my attention back to them. Fell spoke first, his voice low, rumbling like distant thunder muffled by the hills. It's a curious business, Hadley, how evil so often wears the face of necessity. Nash didn't kill for pleasure, nor did Miss Hart deceive for gain, yet both found themselves standing in the same shadow. Hadley snorted softly. You sound like a clergyman, Fell. The law doesn't care about shadows. It only cares about what's proved. Fell's eyes twinkled faintly. Yes, proof, evidence, reason, the scaffolding of truth. But have you ever noticed, Hadley, that truth itself is often softer than its frame? The law condemns the act. The mind must understand the motive. Hadley turned his gaze to the passing hedgerows. You mean to say you pity them? Pity? Fell repeated, puffing out his cheeks. No, my dear fellow comprehension, that is far more dangerous. To understand too well is to risk forgiving too easily. I merely observe that every locked room begins not with a key, but with a lie. Someone always believes they can seal up consequences the way they bolt a door, and yet, like air through a keyhole, truth finds its way out. Hadley grunted. You'll make a philosopher yet. The rest of the drive passed in reflective silence. By the time we reached London, the fog had returned, yellow and thick. Curling through the streets like old parchment smoke, Scotland Yard loomed through it, grim, solid, unshaken by the moral weather that clouded men's hearts. Inside, Hadley gave brisk orders to his men, dispatching reports and evidence to the appropriate divisions. Fell, meanwhile, ambled toward Hadley's office, his cane thudding a slow rhythm across the tiles. Once seated, he exhaled deeply, a sigh that seemed to empty the weariness from his bones. Curious thing about evil, he said, half to himself. It rarely stays in the place where you found it. Like smoke, it drifts and settles elsewhere. I asked him what he meant, but before he could answer, a clerk entered, carrying a telegram. Hadley tore it open and read, his brow furrowing. Well, Fell, your smoke may have drifted faster than you thought. Miss Hart's cousin, the one she mentioned, was found dead this morning in a lodging house in Holborn. Poisoned. Fell's head came up sharply. Poisoned? When? Sometime in the night. The doctor thinks he took it himself. Ah, Fell murmured, his tone unreadable. So the final door closes. He leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Did he leave a note? Hadley shook his head. No. Only an empty envelope addressed to Sir Julian Deverell. The same type and paper Lionel described. A silence followed that was heavier than any before. Even Hadley, who prided himself on detachment, looked uneasy. Fell's gaze had gone distant again, as though he were tracing the last unseen link in an already complete chain. At last, Fell said softly, we see the full design. The cousin wrote the letter that drew Sir Julian's attention to the portrait. Perhaps he meant blackmail, perhaps justice. But once he realized what Nash had done, and that the crime had spread like fire through the house, he saw there was no escape. He destroyed himself rather than face what he had begun. Hadley gave a low whistle. So the circle closes neatly, after all. Fell shook his head. Not neatly, Hadley. Never neatly. The circle of deceit has no seam it feeds upon itself until nothing remains but ashes. That man's death does not tidy the affair. It merely reminds us how untidy human guilt can be. He rose with effort, reaching for his hat. Come, my dear friend. Let's find some dinner before the philosophers in us begin to take root. You'll have your report, and I have a ghost story to forget. Hadley gave a short laugh. You forget a ghost story? Not likely. Fell chuckled, his cane striking the floor like a punctuation mark. Then I shall at least file it away among the others. The Whispering Portrait, category number 17 in the taxonomy of impossible crimes. The case of the voice that came from nowhere and the conscience that could not be silenced. He moved toward the door, his vast form half swallowed by the dim light of the corridor. You see, Hadley, he added over his shoulder, the dead never truly speak. It's only the living who whisper, and sometimes they whisper loudest when they believe themselves unheard. The sound of his laughter followed us out of the yard, rolling through the fog like the echo of a bell long after the church has closed its doors. The fog had thickened by the time we reached the corner of Charing Cross, curling in yellow-grey tendrils that blurred the lamps into trembling halos. Dr. Fell moved with deliberate slowness, his cane tapping the pavement in a rhythm that matched his thoughts. Hadley, trudging beside him, had pulled his collar high against the chill, his breath rising in white puffs. "I'll admit, Fell," he said after a long silence, "this case has left a taste in the mouth. The facts are clear enough, but the meaning of them, blast it. It feels unfinished." Fell chuckled softly, though without much mirth. Unfinished? Perhaps that's because murder, like art, rarely completes its own design. There's always one brushstroke missing the motive behind the motive. Nash killed to hide his thefts, Miss Hart deceived to protect her love, and the cousin died to erase his guilt. But behind all that lies the quiet persistence of consequence. It doesn't vanish with the culprits. It lingers in the air like this damned fog. We crossed the Strand toward a small tavern tucked between a tobacconist and a shuttered bookshop. Inside, the warmth was immediate. The smell of ale and roasted meat soothing after the raw air. The landlord greeted Fell with familiarity. He was a frequent presence there, I gathered, and soon we were installed by the hearth, pints before us, and the murmur of other patrons comfortably distant. Hadley set his hat on the table and leaned forward. "You make it sound like the curse Sir Julian always feared really existed. That portrait, the whispers, the deaths, it feels like the thing was haunted after all." Fell's eyes gleamed behind his spectacles. "Haunted, yes, but not by spirits, by memory. You see, Hadley, guilt and inheritance share a peculiar bond. Each generation inherits not only property, but debts, moral, emotional, spiritual. The Deverells built their fortune on deceit, and each successor bore the weight of that hidden crime until it burst. The portrait merely gave it a face." Hadley gave a short laugh. "So you're telling me every family has its own ghost, eh?" "Exactly so," Fell said, smiling faintly. "Some ghosts wear sheets, others wear respectability." He took a long drink, then added, "The impossible crime, my dear Hadley, is only a reflection of our refusal to look directly at the ordinary. We surround truth with locks and bolts and then marvel that we cannot reach it." For a while, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. The weight that had hung over us since Greystone seemed to lift slightly, replaced by the tavern's quiet contentment. Yet, something in Fell's tone made me think his mind was still turning, unwilling to let go of the case's final threads. At length, he spoke again. "There's one detail, Hadley, which I confess continues to trouble me." Hadley looked up sharply. "Oh, don't tell me there's another twist." Fell's smile deepened. "No, twist, merely a curiosity. When we examined the whispering tube, I found a faint trace of fresh oil along its rim. Nash could not have applied it. He was too occupied during the commotion. Nor Miss Hart. It was recent, within a day or two." Hadley frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Fell said quietly, "that someone else used it after the murder. Perhaps the cousin, before his suicide, perhaps another hand we never saw. The ghost may have whispered one last time. After all, the suggestion sent a chill through me that no fire could dispel." Hadley stared at Fell as if unwilling to believe him. "You think someone tampered with the evidence?" "Not tampered, confirmed," Fell replied. "Whoever oiled that tube wanted to be certain it still carried sound. Perhaps remorse drove him, perhaps pride. But the act was deliberate, not accidental." He leaned back, smoke from his pipe rising in slow spirals. "I do not expect we'll ever know who, but the world is full of hands that finish another man's tragedy." Hadley shook his head. "You do like to leave me with a shiver, Fell." "That's not my doing," Fell said, chuckling. "It's merely the echo of truth. Once an echo begins, it must fade by degrees, but never completely. When we finally stepped out again, the fog had thinned enough for the lamps to burn steadily. London's pulse beat on omnibuses rattling, newsboys calling, the living world asserting itself over the memory of death. Yet as we walked, I could not help glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the dim outline of a portrait hanging in the mist, its painted mouth forever poised to speak. Fell noticed the gesture and gave me a sidelong look of amusement. "You see?" he said. "That's how superstition begins, a simple trick of imagination. But remember, my dear boy, imagination is not falsehood. It's only a mirror turned inward." We reached the corner, where our paths would divide. Hadley hailed a cab, muttering something about reports to file and an early morning ahead. Fell, with a weary grunt, adjusted his scarf and turned toward his lodgings in Russell Square. As I watched him vanish into the fog, his silhouette broad and unhurried, it struck me that he carried an aura unlike any man I had ever known, a mingling of joviality and melancholy, of laughter shaped by wisdom. And perhaps that was why no mystery ever truly defeated him. He saw through both the tricks of men and the shadows of their hearts. The night swallowed him up, and I was left alone on the curb, listening to the distant echo of his cane against the pavement, steady, certain, and receding, like the heartbeat of reason itself, walking calmly through a world still haunted by whispers.